I'm going to take us away from Europe to the place of origins, Africa. Apologies if my voice is a bit croaky. I'm suffering from the allergies of New York at this time of year, even though I've only been here for a day or two. I'm going to start the story probably further back than you would expect. I'm going to begin in a pre-human time with the amazing work of Sarah Hammond, a very recent work in Kenya at Lemekwi, where the very first human tools have been found. So originally we thought that tools began about sort of 2.4 million years ago, and that had been very stable since the time of Louis Leakey. Just in the last couple of years, new tools have come up much earlier. And what makes it interesting now is that tool making has been taken out of the Homo line, and it unquestionably began before what we have now termed Homo. I mean, when you look at the first Homos on this diagram, the reason that they were called Homo is that they were tool makers. So we rather arrogantly put tool making as the thing that makes us human. This unfortunately has now changed, and with these Lemekwi tradition tools that are 3.3 million years ago, it's clear that Australopithecus was the first tool maker. So tools and making technology and material culture is not something that is uniquely human, and we know that as well from ape studies. These tools are sort of, it's a core technology, very simple stone tool technology, good for sort of bludgeoning, getting meat off carcasses that are probably being scavenged. Now, after the invention of tools 3 or so million years ago, we see a slow development. And this development is happening within the Homo line, from the older one tools, which is the famous tools, the earliest tools at that time, and for a long time, found by the Leakey family in Olduvai Gorge, hence Older One. But we move into the Acheulean, which is the classic period that you find all over the world, where Homo erectus created some of the most beautiful stone tools. It's also a core technology. This is a biface, so what is commonly called a hand axe culture. And it's been called a sort of a Swiss Army knife. So this was useful for all sorts of things, for skinning, for removing meat, for a whole range of different activities. It was a one tool for everything. But these tools very much go beyond what is the functional need of the tool. If you look at a tool like this, there's an aesthetic to it, there's a beauty to it that goes far beyond the functional. There's no need for this thing to be entirely symmetrical in order to function for what it was needed to do. There's no need for the very fine finishing. So there's something that goes, I certainly wouldn't call it art, but people have talked about aesthetics. There's something that goes beyond the function, even in these early tools, from about 1 million years ago. What's interesting is that this technology, although it's refined a little bit, remains very static. For about 1 million years, the hand axe cultures dominate the world. I mean, 1 million years, with very little development in terms of stone tools. Until somebody new comes on the scene, and that new person is us. Randy said yesterday that we began about 200,000 years ago, and that has been the knowledge since Richard Leakey's work in the late 70s on the Kenyan-Ethiopian border, that the earliest modern human fossils go back about 200,000 years. For some time, the geneticists have been saying that's not far enough, and that it's almost certainly the first modern human was more like 350,000. And the archaeology, there's a funny, so 200 years ago is not a big sea change archaeologically. 350 is the big sea change archaeologically. And last year, some important new work in Morocco has found a modern human skull dated to older than 300,000 years. So now we're starting to get a bit of alignment between the human fossils, the archaeology, and the genetics. And I think that that's probably going to be fairly stable. We're going to see modern humans developing about 350,000 years ago. Remember that you've got that older line. So in Africa, we only have modern humans. Sort of 500,000 odd years ago, there was a split. 500, 400,000 years as a split. And the folks that went off into Europe became Neanderthals and most parts of Asia, and the Denisovans as well. And that the guys that remained in Africa were ancestors or antecedents of modern humans. So it's Homo sapiens is a particularly African species. But there are other humans, Neanderthals in Europe, which you'll hear about immediately after this. What sets these modern humans apart, and what's really interesting, is the comparison between the modern humans in Africa and modern human behavior in Africa, and what's going on in Neanderthal Europe 250,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. And the big difference is in ochre. You get a little bit of ochre in the Neanderthal layers in Europe. We don't know exactly what they're using it for, but there's incrementally more in Africa. Kilograms and kilograms of ochre in most of the sites. And this goes right back to the very first days of Homo sapiens. So the first site where we're starting to see ochre mining and ochre working is in Zambia, the site of Twin Rivers excavated by Larry Barham. And after 300,000, you get ochre in almost all of the major Stone Age sites across Africa. You start seeing it appear in great abundance. Now, what were they using it for? They were working it, but we can't say that they were necessarily making art with it. And I wanted to make a few very quick comments about art. So any animal, many animals, would use something like ochre to color pieces of rock. And you can teach a chimpanzee to use ochre or other colors to make an artwork like this. But what sets animal art aside from human art is that those scrawls on a paper remain just scrawls on the paper. They never stand for anything that they're not. So, and this probably applies, this is what Gerald Edelman called higher order consciousness. This probably applied, I believe it applied, I know that there are other people who have differing views, but I think it even applied to Neanderthals. So Neanderthals could cover themselves with ochre, they could scrawl with ochre, they might even shove a bit of ochre on a rock face. But it would never stand for anything other than a red marking on the rock. It would never stand for a picture of something. It would never stand for a pot plant with a flower in it. Now you might say, now how is this elephant painting a pot plant with a flower? And there's been a lot of stuff written about, it's amazing in Thailand and Southeast Asia how elephants are now painting, and they can even paint elephants. Do the elephants see that as a pot plant? Do the elephants see the painting of an elephant as an elephant? No. Because they can't repeat it without, if you look very carefully at this, you can see the secret that's kept quite hidden when you go to one of these performances. But the person who's controlling the creation of that pot plant is the lady holding its ear. And as she moves the ear, so it makes its mark on the paper. So she's controlling every aspect of what it's doing. It's only a pot plant to us who see it. It's not a pot plant to the elephant. I think that's the big difference in higher order consciousness. We have some ability that no animal does, to think symbolically, to think analogically. And the rest of my talk will be showing evidence of where this began in Africa and how it began. So we start to see major technological improvements, not right away from 300,000 years ago, but about 150, 130,000 years ago in North Africa, interestingly. It's the Aterian, which goes right across the top of North Africa. You start to see some amazing stone tools, and I'll show you some photographs of these. In southern Africa, which is the area that you're going to see most evidence from because it's the area that's best worked, you start to see similar developments starting about 80,000 years ago, 77 specifically, in these two very interesting traditions, the Stilbe and Howissenspoort. I'll tell you a little bit more about those. So what's special about the Aterian? So we start to move away from a core technology. they're very beautiful hand axes, but these are much finer. So you're starting now to get stone tools that are only 5-6 centimeters long, tanged, so highly sophisticated. Clearly these have been hafted. There would be no point in having a tang if it wasn't being hafted. So a level of sophistication that is a massive move on from what Homo erectus was capable of. And these are the famous southern African ones, industries of the Stilbe and Howissenspoort. These are in sequence. So the Stilbe comes first, 77,000 odd years, and the Howissenspoort around 65,000 years. It follows and develops from. And I'm going to talk a bit about each of these and why they're important. Now, there has been those industries have been known for the best part of a century. And there's been a lot of comment in archaeology, that these mark sort of a big development in human evolution to very sophisticated, small, fine stone tools. There's nothing like this at the time anywhere else in the world. So this is uniquely African, these fine tools at such an early period. And in the 90s, a colleague of mine, when we were both doing a PhD at Cambridge at the same time, said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at the still bay again. This is a guy called Chris Henshelwood. And he was going to go and look at the still bay on a site on his own farm in South Africa. And I was very skeptical. What are you going to say about the still bay that someone hasn't already said? Beautiful stone tools. What else are we going to do? You're not going to find bone remains or anything in those sites. We don't get preservation. Anyway, he proved us all wrong. He went back to this tiny little cave on the South African coast. And that's a fisheye view at the top. Sue O'Connor was asking how big is Blombos. You can see it's tiny. It's only a few meters across. That's Chris Henshelwood, the excavator, standing in the site. And you can see not a very deep deposit either, but an incredibly important deposit. What he started to find, was early was exactly as expected, these highly sophisticated still bay points, also scrapers, which is part of the still bay tradition. So scrapers showing a new ability of humans to manipulate hide in a way that wouldn't have been possible with hand axes, for example. A question still remained as to these still bay points, as to whether they'd been hafted or not. What sets them apart from hand axes is that these have been pressure flaked. So if you look very carefully along the edge, sort of F at the bottom there, you'll see that it's not a hand axe has just been hit with another stone. This is an entirely different technique where you'll get another sharp stone and you will carefully pressure flake off tiny pieces of rock along the edge. And what that does is allow for a much sharper blade technology. It also allows for a blade technology that can be resharpened. If it becomes blunt, you can just pressure flake it again. Chris, when he was working at the site, noticed that some of these stone tools are a little bit reddened, but it was work at another site just along the coast, Pinnacle Point, also a still bay site, that was able to show that the reason a lot of these tools, the silkcrete, has been reddened is that they've been treated with fire. Now, that's a really interesting technological innovation. Silkcrete, when you put it in fire, becomes much harder, and it allows for much sharper and thinner flakes to be produced, so that they were taking a large chunk of silkcrete, putting it in a fire as a way of preparing it to be worked in the most successful way possible. And what that's showing, of course, is that this is a massive transition in our thinking ability from the days of Homo erectus to one where you're actually manipulating raw material to get maximum benefit from it. The other thing that was amazing about Blombos was that Chris found a lot of organic remains. So the Blombos excavations that he started off in, was when I was doing my PhD, so 1993, 1995, he had a couple of seasons there, but he really went back big time in 1999 and carried out 6 consecutive years of excavation at the site. And it was in those important later excavations that he found a lot of this material. So started to pull up dozens and then over 100 bone points. Now, these bone points, you can see from the nature of them, some of them are tanged, have almost certainly been hafted. What are they doing with bone points? This is, again, we see a bone point and we're quite used to this as an archaeologist, but what does a bone point actually stand for? What does it get used for? These kind of bone points in a context like that would almost certainly be fishing harpoons. You can do residue analysis on these things and demonstrate that they have been used for killing seals, killing fish. Now, it takes a particular type of cognitive precision to think that when you eat an animal, in this case, these are antelope mostly, the bones of antelope, to take that leg bone, to smash it open, not just eat the marrow out of it, as a Neanderthal would do, but then, certainly the early hominids were not doing anything like this, to be able to think that that animal could become something that you can then place on a stick, go off into the water and hunt fish with it. that requires a really complex thinking process, a really complex planning process that is only around from 100,000 odd years ago, and is particular to the very last people in the hominin lines. What's also interesting is that a lot of these bone tools, you can probably see some of them here, but they're covered in ochre. And more than that, there's bone awls as well. This is a very beautiful one that was featured in National Geographic in 1999. And those bone awls have been used for piercing something almost certainly when you get this kind of luster on the ochre. It's been rubbed in ochre, polished, but it's then been used almost certainly for something like hide sewing. It's the only way you could get that degree of luster on it. So it's potentially a proxy that these people were wearing sewn clothing. Again, another development that we think happened only in the very last parts of the hominin line, the human line. Now, where's this ochre coming from? What are they doing with it? Ian Watts, a PhD student, started to he was employed by Chris to go through all the old ochre collections and look at, is there any marks on them that we can try and get a sense of why, what are they doing with the ochre? Certainly they're sort of scraping it, they're trying to get powder off it. Is there anything more that we can do with the ochre? And he worked through all the ochre collections of all the early excavated sites. And this is one of the earliest ones from South Africa, Classy's River mouth, the famous site excavated by the Deacons in the 70s and 80s. And he made an astonishing discovery in 1999 looking through the Blombos ochre. He noticed that one of the pieces of ochre that Chris had collected had marks on it, but marks that were more than just the natural, normal marks that you get when you're powdering ochre. You can see those sort of normal, natural marks on all of these if you look carefully. These have all been scraped and there's scrape marks on them. But this one didn't have that kind of scrape marks. It's got a smooth surface, so they've ground down one side of that piece of ochre. But then they've made a few marks on it that are more precise, more intentional than the kind of mark you get when you're just trying to powder ochre. You can see here that you've got lines going one way, and then potentially a few lines going the other way, and making a sort of a crosshatch design. This was very exciting. It's the first decorated piece that had ever been found in these still bay layers. The following year, when they went back, they were specifically looking then for these things in the excavation. And Royden Yates, one of the excavators, he'd looked at this is that piece again in a little bit more detail, so you can see the crosshatch. So Royden Yates was now looking out for these kind of pieces, so was Chris Henshaw. And sure enough, as they were excavating, out popped another piece of ochre. They looked at it more carefully, and it's the same design again, just better preserved in this case. So you can see what's special about this is that you've got hatch lines going one way in a diagonal, hatch lines going the other way to make the sort of chevron crisscross pattern. But then you have a line across the top, the bottom, and there's even a line across the middle, which will be clearer in the tracing here. So that this astonished the world. And the immediate reaction, of course, of the French, the dating must be wrong. Africans can't date things properly. They're trying to say that all this stuff is happening 77,000 years ago. Not possible. Art began in France or Spain, but probably France. So Chris got 5 different dating teams in from all over the world, and managed within I would say about 5 years to convince the whole world that the dates were right. The question then is, what about this? What about these pieces? What are they? What do they represent? Are they art? So a bit of a debate around that. Now, even artists can't define what art is, and I'm not going to attempt to do it here. Randy had a pretty good go at it last night. I'll defer to him on it. But this is some form of decoration that clearly goes beyond the function. It clearly goes beyond something that is purely functional. It's a decorative design motif that would fall within almost anyone's definition of the term art, and became instantly then the world's oldest piece of art at 77,000 years ago. Now, what does this actually mean about the people? it's a long time after Homo sapiens arrived on the scene. So we arrived 300,000 years ago. This is 77,000 years ago. But it comes in a context of growing complexity. And there were other things that came out of the Blombos site that showed that complexity. When these were first found, in fact, at Classes Rivermouth. These are the ones you're seeing from Blombos, but people had known about these shells that were pierced for some time. And these shells get pierced naturally by predators in the ocean when they're trying to predate these shells. But Chris started to think, well, in the context of art, maybe there's more to this. There's a certain regularity to these pieces and where they've been pieced, whereas in the wild examples, they tend to get pierced all over the show. They are also appearing in sets in the site. So each one of these numbered sets were found in little clusters in the site. And so Francesco Derrico was brought in to become part of the team and to analyze these and to do some simulation studies and perhaps how these were made. So he found that those bone awls that I showed you were perfect tools for making the holes in the beads, in the shells. And that when you looked under a microscope, and if you look at the images on the right, so on the left you have the experimental perforation, and on the right you have the actual beads. If you look really carefully, I don't know if you can, yeah, you can see that. Along here, this side is very smooth, whereas this side is rough. Along this piece, you can see it here again. Very, very smooth. Very, very smooth. Very, very smooth. Now, this is important. If one side of that perforation has been smooth and the other side hasn't, if you were to string this, it would hang along this side with the heavy part down. And what this means is that, so they were found in little clusters of between 4 and 12. And they have been strung on some kind of twine. So first we've got evidence now of twine, but secondly we've then got evidence that people were making some kind of decoration. Now whether this is a necklace or an ankle bracelet, but they're stringing groups of shells, placing them around their neck. Now this is again there's the potential here of symbolism. On a Neanderthal, I think these would just be shells. These have now been strung to a point where they would probably rattle, make a noise. They could have been used in the creation of music. But in a modern human context, they could also stand for something. They could stand for status. They could stand for gender. We'll never know exactly what they stood for. But here is another item that can carry symbolic expression. One of the most recent exciting finds, going into the deeper layers of the site, is this abalone shell. Abalone is a special shell, very beautiful for its sort of mother of pearl. It's the haliotis is the name. Absolutely, or orma, I think in America people use that term as well. Beautiful iridescent shell. And this shell, when it came out of the deposit, it was obviously had been put there. It had a whole pile of stuff in it. And you can see at the bottom of the shell, this is as it's coming out, it's absolutely full of ochre. And that you've even got the grinding stone. This has just been picked off from on top. So it's an ochre workshop, the place where they were grinding the ochre, creating this powdered ochre for whatever it was that they were using it for. So again, a highly sophisticated human behavior at a very early period. Now, looking at the stone tools, is there anything on the stone tools that can give us a sense of sophistication? Well, Lynn Wadley's team at another site, Sibudu Cave, now this is on the other coast, this is on the Indian Ocean coast of South Africa, so completely the other side of the country, was doing detailed analysis, in this case of Howison sport tools. So this is the tradition that immediately followed the still bay. And the PhD work of Marilise Lombard was able to demonstrate without question that these tools had been hafted. So there is an ochre mastic still surviving, which you can see in Marlise's photographs here, on many of these tools. And so that they were hafted in some way, almost certainly the larger ones hafted as spears, and the smaller ones hafted as arrowheads. And you can even see from the way they've been nicked that they've been used as arrows. So bow and arrow technology, again, requires the use of twine. You can't have a bow without the piece of wood and the twine to pull it. So as soon as you've got twine, you've got the possibility of things like baskets, complex clothing. These people have made a whole load of human developments that bring them very close to us in their abilities. We shouldn't think of these as very simple, primitive hunter-gatherers. They had almost all of the capacities that we have today to make their life comfortable. And one shouldn't forget that the most recent hunter-gatherers in Africa, like the Bushmen, when they were studied in the 1950s, had the highest amount of leisure time of any population in the world at that time. So in the 1950s, so they had a life way that created for them, with whatever harshness comes of living in the Kalahari, but nonetheless a life way that had a higher degree of pleasure and leisure time than ours. So we shouldn't think of this as a primitive society. They made a life choice that in some ways might be considered better than the life choice we've made. And they'd created high tensile cord, which is a huge development in human evolution. Juno Makeda from Calgary in Canada has been working on sites, a couple of sites dated to this period in Mozambique. So now you're heading around the East African coast, up the Indian Ocean coast. And what he found from residue analysis of tools in Mozambique was starch grains. So that these tools had been used for processing starch. Now, that's important in and of itself because it gives us a sense of diet and that people have moved on to processing starch within their diet, so very different from the early hominids. But it also means that starch is a proxy for the requirement to cook. The plants that they were processing would have been toxic if they hadn't been cooked. So he's made a case, and it's a strong one, that you've got a proxy for cooking food 100,000 years ago, the same kind of period in Mozambique. So the art is important, but it's all this other stuff that goes with it that gives us that sense of that this is a society that has moved forward in an incremental way and that the human brain is now functioning on exactly the same kind of level that we function today, would have been capable of music, dance, and all of the things that we know today. We have so few proxies for music and dance, we have none, really. There are musical instruments in Africa, like rock gongs, for example, but we don't have dates on when they started to get used. Now, I want to show you in my final 10 minutes that Blombos was not a flash in the pan. It wasn't... it's not exceptional. There are other sites that give us a richer pattern, but a similar pattern. This is John Parkington, his team working at Deep Cliff, about 300 kilometers north of Blombos on the Atlantic coast. And he found not pieces of ochre engraved, but pieces of ostrich eggshell engraved, also dated to the late Stilbay, early Howisson's-Port periods. These almost certainly were water carriers, and in the Kalahari 1950s, Bushman groups were still using ostrich eggshell as water carriers, and indeed still making decoration on it, such as the one that you see here. This is an ethnographic piece collected in the 1950s. Now, these older pieces, 65,000 years ago, have a remarkable congruence with what I showed you from Blombos. You haven't quite got the chevron pattern, but you've got that grid pattern with the line at the top, the line at the bottom. You've also got what's interesting is these are being colored with ochre and manganese and other things, so that you've got a similar use of pigments going on in collaboration with the marking. At another site, an Australian, Alex Mackay, found another piece of engraved ochre, not quite so spectacular. Possibly, it's in a less securely dated deposit as well from Clay and Cliphace, dated to between 50 and 80,000. But again, you've got a sort of a grid-like pattern that would not have been made through a simple functional process. Now we've got this incredible flourishing of complex human behavior 100,000 to 60-odd thousand years ago. And then there's a difficult gap. It's 27,000 years ago before we get the first dated piece of figurative art, which is actually this plaquette from Namibia. What happened between then? So some people have said, oh, there were these very inventive Africans that were around for quite a short period, maybe 10,000 years or so. And then the experiment failed. They went back to not doing very much until all the big action starts off in Europe again. So that, everyone wants to see Europe being the center. I fear that Europe is and was a backwater. That's what they used to say about Africa. So I'm knowingly turning the scales. So that the big news, the big inventions are happening in Africa, and Europe's being a recipient of these. So what happened in between? Well, I charged one of my postdocs. I said, go back to the old collections, the stuff when people thought, there couldn't be art on any of that early stuff. Go through them all, get every one of our collections out, and look through those old pieces and see if you can find stuff. This was Helen Anderson, and she did find some pieces, interestingly, from that period between 27,000 years ago and 80,000 years ago. She found this, this is indeed, I'm going to show you the published pieces, but she found some unpublished pieces as well. This engraved, so it's a stone tool that has been engraved in a linear form. These came from Middle Stone Age deposits, but because they came out earlier, not well dated. But they certainly date in the sort of, you can be sure that they're older than 40,000. They could be as old as 80, but they're most likely to date between about 40 and 60, because that's when most of these sort of generic Middle Stone Age sites date from. Once they go over 60, we can recognize them very clearly because they have these Hausenport stone tools and the Stilbay stone tools. So if they're just called Middle Stone Age, they're younger than the Hausenport usually. Another one from KwaZulu-Natal, so on the other side, the Indian Ocean side, actually quite a complex piece, rather beautifully incised and found back in the 1960s, and the significance missed at the time. And a final one from Namibia, with a design that is astonishingly like the Blombos design. A crosshatch piece found in an open Middle Stone Age site in Namibia, just lying out in the desert of Namibia, with this beautiful crosshatch pattern that is almost an exact replica of the Blombos decorated ochre. So I think that further research and further work is going to fill that gap between 27,000 years ago and 80. And what we're going to see is a continuity, sort of this incremental development in modern human behavior. What's interesting is that it does seem to be moving from geometric art through to figurative art. That was the old idea that art must have started in some sort of stumbling early way of making geometric art, and that we sort of moved through sort of childlike art up to the most sophisticated art of Europe in the 1800s of sort of Canaletto and stuff. But with the finding of Chauvet that we're going to see later today, that was turned on its head because some of the most sophisticated art was in fact the oldest art. This African stuff is a bit awkward because it does seem to start geometric and rather simple. And I'm not sure what we make of that. Whether there was figurative art around at the time, heaven only knows. What does it all represent? Well, one of the only explanations. So Helen Anderson, the postdoctoral fellow that I employed to look at that, to look for these extra pieces, said her conclusion was that there is such a regularity in these early art images that it has to have a material referent. And the only material referent that really works for all of those pieces are sort of nets and baskets, some kind of woven pattern. It's an interesting idea. We have no evidence, of course, for nets and baskets at this time, other than that it would have been possible to make them, given that they had twine technology. It's an interesting idea, but it remains that, and I suspect it will do for some years. There are other things to suggest that they were fully capable of making nets and baskets, and I'm just going to show a few of them in the last 5 minutes. We know that they were making beds and bedding. This is one of the most exciting finds from Sibudu of the last few years. And you can see in these layers, this is Lynn Wadley's work, now Nick Conard working in the same site, that because she's such a careful excavator, Lynn started to see individual plant leaves or tree leaves in the excavated layer. This is almost unprecedented to have leaves preserved in archaeological layers. And she was able, because she had the actual imprint of leaves, to see exactly which plants were being used in making these beds, so that people were putting a sort of a nice 6-inch layer of leaves in a beautiful little nest and clearly sleeping there. And they were using, interestingly, types of plant that are a natural insecticide. So that they were bringing in from the swamp down below the site, these leaves that, rather like we use citronella today, were keeping the mosquitoes away so that they had a comfortable night. More than that, at about 73,000, you can see, so all of these layers have been burnt. So not only that, even though it has insecticidal properties when you first collect it, over time you'll get lice and other things coming into those layers. And so what they were doing to clean the site is that whenever they left the site, it's quite clear that they were burning it, and then coming back to a totally clean site where all of those lice and other things that were in the layers had been killed by burning. So highly sophisticated behavior, creating beds with insecticidal properties and burning them to stop critter infestation. We don't have burials. There is one burial just outside of Africa, at Kafse in Israel, that's dated to this same kind of period, 90 to 100,000. So it shows that burials are there. I'm not sure why we haven't found them. Bone is a big problem at many African sites. Almost certainly it's there. And this is a symbolic burial as well. It's got an antler, a deer antler placed with the body, and the body has been carefully prepared and put into a nook. So it's fulfilling all the expectations. And if you've got burial, you've got something else. Why do you bury the dead? Why did no other hominid bury the dead? No other early hominid? You have to, if you're placing someone in a nook with grave goods, you've got to believe in an afterlife. You've got to have some form of religion. What's happening in other parts of Africa? I've shown you mostly stuff from southern Africa. And that's because there hasn't been that much work in other parts of Africa. But there is stuff now, and there's people working across North Africa at the moment producing amazing finds. But we do see similar things. We get these amazing wooden fishing harpoons from the Congo, so that's right in the middle, what used to be called Zaire. And we get similar beads and necklaces from that Aterian right across the north part of Africa. We've even got old beads. Here's one from 70,000 in Tanzania. So right across Africa, this complexity is there. I want to finish. I talked a bit about the burial being proxy for religion. I want to finish with some thoughts on that. With a site that I think has been somewhat overlooked. It's the site that's been excavated by Sheila Coulson in Botswana. And it's a really important excavation, but it doesn't get talked about very much. And I don't really understand why. It's a beautiful site. It's the Sibudu Hills is one of these sort of magic places. It's this jewel in the middle of the Kalahari where there's water, still got Bushman groups living there with beliefs and traditions about the place. And Sheila went there to see if she could find some of these Middle Stone Age sites in the Sibudu Hills. I'd been there before photographing rock art, and of course had missed, having worked at this site for a couple of years, and completely missed its significance, as rock art people tend to do. Sheila looked at this and said, hang on, there's something really interesting going on here. I'd been focusing on the rock art on the right. She looked on the left, and I'd noticed this, but it hadn't occurred to me that there was a deposit that was excavatable right below it. This whole rock here is covered with carvings. I'm going to show you a picture, a close-up in a moment. But every single aspect of this is being gouged out. Now, we get these in Africa. They're not. I've seen dozens of rock surfaces like this, and we always say when we look at them, they're early. But we've never had dating techniques. We've never known how early. People say the same thing in Australia, so I just thought, oh, this is just archaeologists. We always say this stuff's early, without knowing how early. Sheila thought, well, hang on, if there's excavated layers below, this is intense gouging. We should be able to find bits of this that flaked off, and if we can date the layers below it, we can actually put a date on when they were gouging this stuff. It's an incredible effort. I mean, look at the amount. These are big. These are things like this, and the circles are like that. There's hundreds and hundreds of lenticular and circular grooves that have been gouged out of this rock. And only this rock. The other side, there's nothing gouged at all. They've just focused on this one rock. And Sheila got lucky. So she put in a hole right below it, and she found not only one of the pieces that had been gouged out, and you can see the gouge mark, but also one of the tools that had been used for making the gouging. And she found it in a layer that there's some questions about the stratigraphic integrity, but it's the excavators who have convinced me of its integrity. She found it, and what convinces me of the integrity is that it was found, there are Botswana has its own stone tool chronology, and without going into detail, they also have something that's very distinctive around 60,000, a particular type of stone tool that is only found at that time. And this was found in the layer immediately below it. So that puts it to older than 60,000, probably in the sort of 70 to 80,000 in the Blombos bracket. So this was being made. So Blombos is this small piece of stone, some sort of personal statement. It's very smooth, as if it had been kept in a pouch, maybe for some sort of personal symbolic use. This is a big statement now. You've covered a whole rock in engravings. More than that, amazing other things were found. She found that absolutely beautiful red tools. You'll remember that red is usually a sign of burning, and that's the case in this case. You'll probably see, Bruno will see immediately that this is a refit. This has been smashed, and an archaeologist has put it back together. What's interesting about this is that Sheila is a useware specialist, and this stone tool was made, but it was never used. So there's no useware on it whatsoever. It's made of a raw material that is only found about 200 kilometers from Sibudu Hill. So someone has traveled a very long distance to get this tool. They made it off-site. There's no working here. They brought it to the site. They've put it in front of the rock. And the way that this has been destroyed is by placing it in a fire. Someone has placed it in a fire and exploded it. So they've taken a stone tool that has never been used. It's obviously quite precious because it's come from a long way away. And they've broken it right in front of that engraved rock. Not just one example, but many. So one would have to say that that is some kind of ritual. We don't know what was intended by it, but someone has gone to a great deal of care and attention to bring a gift or some sort of offering to this rock and destroy it in front of that rock. We have no other evidence of ritual or anything like that at this time. This is really exciting stuff. Now, Sheila has said that that rock looks a bit like a snake. It may or may not. Whatever you see in that rock doesn't really matter. There are old tales of magical snakes in the rocks, but then there are across Africa. And I don't particularly believe that tales like that can survive for 70,000 years. But they saw something in this rock. They didn't think that this was just a rock. They thought that this rock could somehow influence their lives. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made this offering and sacrifice of a stone tool right in front of it. So what we've got here, I believe, is the proof, really, of what we're seeing at Blombos, that ritual religion, religious thought has begun, belief in an afterlife, belief in the spirits beyond, and people have started to make offerings to this other life. So with religion goes all of that, all of the human modernity that we know. We have become the fully modern humans that we are today. And so really, how far have we come in the last 80,000 years? So much of what we take for granted today already existed 80,000 years ago. These were not primitive savages. They were people very much like us today, maybe even more inventive than us today. These people were forging ahead with technological innovation. It's an absolutely remarkable record, and it's a great privilege that I've had for the last 20 years of working in Africa and working with some of this material. Thank you very much.
Well, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome in the Neanderthal world. Thank you very much for be here, and let me thank my colleague, Professor Randall White, and the staff and colleagues for having given me this opportunity to be here, to tell about the Neanderthals, to visit for the first time the United States and New York and so on. So I'll never forget. Thank you. So, as I was saying, welcome in the Neanderthal world. Neanderthals are so attractive for us because they, since their discovery occurred in the second half of the 19th century, they have also been viewed like our relatives, counterparts, alter ego, and comparison between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens have featured and characterized the studies on this phase of human evolution. Neanderthals in Europe originated from Homo heidelbergensis around 4 100,000 years BP, as it has been observed based on changes, modifications in physical anthropology, in physical anatomical characters of remains discovered in Spain. And Neanderthal, as I said, has also been considered our relative, so attractive, and studies have been carried out on many different aspects of his behavior, his evolution, his presence, and in Europe and well outside Europe. So as I say, the Neanderthals started appearing in the biological. The biological scale around 400,000 years BP, then their classic anatomy appeared around 200,000 BP, and they were the settlers of Europe, inhabitants of Europe, and starting from around 100,000 years BP, at the beginning of the late Pleistocene, they expanded the Homo range. They colonized, occupied the Near East. They went to the east in the middle latitude range in Central Asia, in the south of Siberia. So they were a fully adapted species, fully adapted by humans to the European and to the Middle Asiatic climatic and ecological contexts. So they survived to several glaciations, climatic oscillations, and they demonstrated to be formidable hunters, fully adapted and able to settle different environments from the Alps and the Apennines till 2,000 meters of elevation, to the coast, the Mediterranean coast, the plains, the hills, and so on. So the behavior is clearly demonstrated, clearly recorded by several, many and thousands of sites in caves, at the open, dug and investigated in the Russian plain, till to the west in the Iberia and France and western countries. But concerning the behavior, the symbolic behavior, Neanderthals has always full debates. Hot debates, and especially in the last 30 years, when at the end of the 90s, a general review of the archaeological record, on the archaeological data, the chronological data, supported some colleagues to suggest that to prove to consider that Neanderthal had symbolic behaviors. And symbolic behaviors are vehiculated by different items, different categories. So there's burials, engraved bones, red or black mineral pigment, and other items that we'll see in the next slides. But due to the different anatomical features of the brain and the different way to organize the life, the sites, the settlements, this difference has also been viewed as a critical threshold to consider Neanderthals not fully or completely or totally comparable to us. And this supported idea, renewed idea, starting from the end of the 90s, as I said, full warm debates. And the debates are still living because, as you have seen yesterday by the talk given by Professor White. The debate is continuously full, renewed. Now a new debate will start because a couple of months ago, at the end of February, a remarkable paper has been published on Science, on a big journal, suggesting that Neanderthals were the first cave painters in Europe. And the Neanderthals were responsible of drawings of hand stencils. And the stencils are a very old act. One of the oldest acts we do when we started to be living, and this paper, this article describes presents the new dates achieved from using uranium-thorium method on samples or microsamples collected in carbonatic crusts covering the hand stencils and other drawings that we'll see. And as you have seen yesterday, these dates push back this evidence, this art. This art to 70, 65, 65 years BP is considered as a minimum age. But I think that we know that in a few weeks a big paper presenting critics on this new set of dates will be published, and will full debate, will dismantle the idea that Neanderthals were the first artists in Europe, in caves in Spain. But however, Neanderthals have much changed their image in the last years, and this was done was due thanks to new discoveries, to re-examination of all the findings. But look, for instance, at this comparison between an image, a drawing done in the mid of the last century by a Czech artist, August Burian, who drawn this Neanderthal handing a digging stick and grafting a sparrowhawk, but with no evidence at the time of the use of by Neanderthals of wooden digging sticks and the capability to hunt, to capture raptors, sparrowhawks like that one drawn. So this was in the artist's mind. But what we see in the image on the right is based on reliable archaeological evidence and archaeological evidence, and this is an important improvement in our imagination and view of Neanderthals, because given to this warm debate, archaeologists are have to secure their evidence, to produce reliable dates, to collect samples in reliable contexts. Every discovery is seriously screened by the scientific community and must be protected, must be secured by the discoverer, by the coordinator of the research. Now we'll see how this was possible, how this new image was created based on new findings. For instance, the fox fur you see is based on the evidence produced in several sites that Neanderthals were able to hunt foxes and wolves and to recover furs from those carnivores. And feathers will be the subject of the next slides, because feathers are an important element of symbolic behavior for us, for Homo sapiens. I was walking yesterday on the Fifth Avenue and I hadn't my phone to take a picture of a man dressed and with the feathers on the hat. But feathers are, as I said, the one of the most useful used item in decoration and in the body and dresses decoration, and particularly feathers from from big raptors. Here you see the picture of a lammergeier hunted at the beginning of the last century. Lammergeier, like other vultures, is one of the biggest birds in nature, and the relation with birds, the interaction with birds, goes back to the past, to the Middle Pleistocene, based on a nice amount, a big amount of data, because we know that birds were, or we think, and some paleontologists consider this idea that birds were attractive for humans, and especially in the first phases of human evolution, probably the vultures and the bigger raptors, which competed with humans in collecting carcasses and taking food from meat from carcasses, were indicated the presence of carcasses for humans living in the savannah. And this idea was also tested by paleontologists in the mid-50s, who spent a few weeks in the savannah looking for carcasses by the observation by observing the sky. So our relation with the big raptors, with the birds, probably is roots goes back to unknown periods. And in the last years, especially in the last 10 years, new data have been produced from zooarchaeological assemblages, especially from Mediterranean Europe, telling us that Neanderthals were able to hunt birds of different species, different genera, and to exploit these birds as a food, but also to exploit these birds as elements to take feathers and to take a part of the wings. And I thank Randall because he cited the Grotta di Fumane. Grotta di Fumane, I promote my site. I promote the site in the north of Italy. It's not far from the town of Verona, which is well known from the arena, Roman arena, the opera, and so on. And Grotta di Fumane is a remarkable site where we discovered in the well-preserved late Middle Paleolithic sequence dating back to 50 up to 44,000 years BP. We discovered many birds, bones, with bearing traces of human modification. Among these huge assemblages, over 5 years ago, we observed, we detected traces of ascribable to the cutting, the splitting of the wings, to the extraction of feathers from bigger raptors, from vultures like the lammergeier, and from other raptors. And these cut marks clearly prove that the Neanderthals they were interested in dividing wings, in the taking part of the wings and extracting the longer feathers. The longer feathers are spectacular because we did archaeological experimentations, and we know how it is complicated and difficult to extract the feathers by hands. You need a cutting tool. And the proof that Neanderthals were the actors of this action, of this in this period, comes from cultural items, flakes, stone tools, but also from DNA extracted from the sediments. I got new results by Max Planck, by collaborators from Max Planck, from Lipsia. So they were able to detect DNA, Neanderthal DNA from the sediments. So Neanderthals were the responsible of this accumulation of bare bones. And as you can see, the bigger raptors are the biggest in nature, and the vultures and the feathers are long, over 60 centimeters, and of spectacular interest. But not only raptors, but also smaller raptors like eagles, falcons, were targeted by Neanderthals for extracting feathers, dividing wings, and so on. And this is a new discovery we published a couple of years ago and presented at an international congress. And this discovery got confirmation by colleagues from Gibraltar and others from other sides of Europe, and this confirmation clearly tells that black-feathered birds like Alpine chaff, for instance, were also targeted by Neanderthals. As you can see in these pictures, cut marks, grooves are clearly well preserved on the ulna, on the wing bone surfaces. And also the dove, the common wood pigeon, was targeted by Neanderthals. But a recent discovery we did in the last 5 years. I speaking by the side of a small community of archaeologists who are focusing on this specific behavior of Neanderthals. A recent discovery has been done in the last years, thanks to the presence of cut marks you see in the lower left right part of the slide, of cut marks preserved on the apex of the eagle claw. The eagle claw, as you can see, is one of the most powerful structure for birds, and was according to our opinion, to our inference, was separated from the talon, from the bird, for symbolic, for ornamental purposes. Other discoveries were made in Mediterranean Europe, where you can see there are sites in south of France, in the north of Italy, and a recent rediscovery was published 3 years ago by colleagues from Krapina, from Croatia, because in this remarkable site dug at the beginning of the last century, the archaeologists, the paleontologists, described the discovery of remnants of eagle talons, eagle claws, and these remnants were stored in the museum and never considered until the publication of our eagle claws, of eagle claws from France, and so on. So this discovery was reconsidered, and colleagues were able to detect the same anthropic traces of anthropic modification targeted to extract the claw. And this is an aspect which has not comparable in the earliest phases of the Upper Paleolithic. So the first early anatomically modern humans didn't use this material for symbolic purposes. Probably this is a bias in research. Probably in the future, in the next future, new data, new evidence will be produced. But we know that feathers and parts of the wings and part of the birds were used as adornment for different members of the societies of the hunter-gatherer societies. And I heard that in Crimea, in a site dug in the mid of the 80s, the archaeologists discovered in a sort of burial of an eagle, and the eagle, the skeleton was lacked of the claws and of the back of the eagle. The date of this discovery goes back to the first phases of the early of the Upper Paleolithic, so probably it can be ascribed to the first anatomically modern humans who settled there. But this material requires a new information and new data. As concerns Neanderthals, we know from a long time that they collected items, they collected the fossils, they collected material with no functional or economical significance, and but the most important evidence concerns the burials, the practice to bury the deceased people, and the burials were discovered since the beginning, since the last century, and in the famous La Ferrara, the famous sites and burials were associated. So the individuals were associated to what was considered a funerary good, like the scrapers in La Ferrara 5, like this big boulder with the couples in La Ferrara 6, and so on. Or in as concerns the latest discovered burials, especially in the eastern country, these burials contain the skeletons, the remains of young individuals associated with ibex horns, maxillary of red deer, or flint flakes, and so on. But in any case, this evidence was, however, was criticized. It was under the focus of criticisms because probably due to the old discovery carried out at the beginning of the last century with methods which are not compatible with the current standard of research, and somebody suggested that carnivores scavenged the burial and perturbated the burial, and so on. And so we need a new discovery, a new burial for Neanderthals, and in order to better detect and to secure this behavior. Yesterday, Professor White mentioned the French Châtel-Perronian findings, items, symbolic items, which have been associated to Neanderthals since the mid of the 90s. But this site is again under the focus of debate because it was a rescue excavation. It was in one of the sites was a rescue excavation. Arcy-sur-Cure was dug in the mid of the 60s, and so the archaeological methods were not comparable, as I said, to the current standard. So a sort of a sort of a limitation affects all these situation, these evidences. But luckily in the new sites, the sites in course of excavation, where the excavation is going, sometimes something happens, like again the case of Fumana, where we discovered this fragmentary shell you see here, and you see the complete specimen in below. This shell was was a Pliocene age, and collected by Neanderthals who covered 100 kilometers to collect this material. It was made of ochre, and microscopic investigation and demonstrated that the shell was appended, was tied with a cord, with a string. Other shells were largely published coming from south of Spain. We don't have a clear evidence of the use as symbolic items of this material, but this material was found in England, so far from the coast, and was used as a container of ochre. And ochre is a component, was a component of the Neanderthal archaeological record. Ochre was mentioned and discovered a long time ago, and but again, in some cases, this sort considered the mineral pigment was interpreted in a different way, like in this remarkable case based on the findings from Pech-Delaz. A new study of this material clearly demonstrates, supports the idea that this material was powdered in order to reinforce lighting of the fires, so to activate the lighting of fires. But luckily, new excavations are producing more and more material. You see here from a site in the north of France, blocks of mineral pigment, red or black, engraved and scraped to produce powder. And the use of this powder, we know, goes back to all the periods, and started to be systematic in the Middle Stone Age, starting from 300,000 years BP, 200,000 years BP in Africa, but also in Europe, in a very ephemeral context. Is in some cases ochre, the use of ochre, of red ochre, has been reported in a few sites, like in Maastricht Belvedere, dating back to 250,000 years BP. And ochre was used by Neanderthals. We don't know exactly for which function, and the function was proposed on February by our colleagues who dated these paintings to a period when Neanderthals were clearly settled in Europe, and modern humans were still outside Europe, because as we know from the last dates that modern humans were in the southern part of Europe, in Italy, in around 45,000 years BP, and then they spread and occupied other regions of Europe. But this is a material from a hot debate who is raising again, helping us to improve data, to ameliorate our presentation. Also, this evidence was mentioned by Professor Wyatt yesterday, because if Neanderthals were familiar with darkness, with caves, and Neanderthals were the responsible of these cycles of fragmentary speleothems associated to burnt bones, to other smaller structures, the interpretation of which is still ongoing, and the research is still ongoing in this famous Bruniquel cave. And going to the end of my presentation, I cannot miss to mention the famous flute of Divier-Babé. This is a small cavity occupied by cave bears and sometimes by Neanderthals, and then by anatomically modern humans in Slovenia, in the Eastern Alps. And in the mid-80s, archaeologists discovered this cave bear tibia perforated and interpreted it as a flute. But recent publications produced in the last 5 years clearly demonstrate that this was a gift of hyenas. So these perforations were produced by hyena. Yeah, then we'll discuss, but thank you. And more certitude is related to the engraved pebbles, but in some cases this material, in most of the cases, this material has been screened by taphonomic analysis, and in sometimes these analysis demonstrated that the engravings on bones were of natural origin, in other cases were of functional origin, but in some very few findings clearly show that equally spaced engravings, the significance of which is still ongoing, is still open, unclear, have been detected on bones dating back to around 50,000 years. And another recent discovery, recent examination concerns this bird bone found in a Crimean site. But the problem is that you see the dating of this material goes back to time lapse coinciding with the presence of the first anatomically modern humans in Europe. So the attribution, of course, the cultural attribution of this material to the Middle Paleolithic is secured, but the attribution of this piece, the actor, is still debated. And the last one of the last slides presents this engraving. The engraving is preserved in the back in the rear of the cave in Gibraltar, and was considered an act of Neanderthals who engraved this stone pavement. But last year, zooarchaeologists published a paper, and they considered the cave bears like the responsibles of this engravings and this crisscross pattern. And so, as you can see, each evidence must be secured. We have to produce overproof, to secure the data to suggest that Neanderthals did something different than the normal, the basic functional, the basic subsistence behavior. Luckily, a long time has passed since these first statements of the famous Irish English geologist William King, who proposed that Neanderthals were not were not humans, cannot be ascribed, inserted in the human range. And luckily also Neanderthals in the last 15 years acquired more data concerning this not functional behavior, but the symbolic behavior. But to refresh our mind and your mind, I propose you to visit this Neanderthal Expo in Paris, a remarkable exhibition, temporary exhibition inaugurated at the end of March, and I announce also this conference, which will be held in Italy at the end of August. So I've taken too much time, but okay. Thank you very much for attention.